Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I want to talk a little bit about something I've been thinking about for a long time, but have only finally kind of come to understand in an explainable way. And that's my take on the whole custom versus production versus mid-tech sort of affair in the knife world. And so to start off, I want to talk a little bit about the different levels of, the scale of customicity, going all the way from production knives down to something that's, really exclusive, custom, uncontroversially so. So let's jump into it. So what I've tried to do here is kind of divide the knife world into 8 different categories of, customness, if you will, and so I can talk intelligently about the differences among these. And the first of these categories is large volume production knives. These are companies that tend to be very large companies and that tend to make lots and lots and lots of knives. These are the things you have a chance at buying at your local sporting goods store in all likelihood. Companies like Benchmade, ZT, Spyderco, Cricut, Kershaw, Z-Hunter, Kaiser, Wrought, although Wrought's getting to be smaller in the volume, but nonetheless, the goal with these production knives is to make the same knife over and over again. And some examples from my own collection would be like the Spyderco Delica, the Rat number 1 here, or, even the, what else? The ZT452 is a really good example of this as well. It's a knife that's really designed so that every 452 is going to be the same thing, and ideally they're all going to be pretty good. The thing is, though, that there's a smaller level of that, and that's what I'm calling small volume production. These are companies like Chris Reeve Knives, or Shirogorov Knives, Ferrum Forge, Custom Knife Factory, Alamic Tactical, their Midtech line. These are companies that are making basically smaller quantities of knives, even though they're all supposed to be the same. So, every Chris Reeve Knives Sebenza should be pretty similar to the last one. They all should be very, very good. Same thing with your Shirogorov Neons. All of these knives should be pretty much identical, and they should be great. Same thing with your Ferrums, although there's some customization. We'll talk about that there. This is also the category into which the mid-tech thing falls into. I don't love the term mid-tech because it means everything and nothing. Nobody can quite tell me what is or isn't a mid-tech. No one draws a line in the sand. So it's just come to mean knives made in small batches. So these, field grade is very similar. Like the knives that are being made by Millet Knives these days, where a knife maker contracts with them and gets a run of their stuff. Rick Hinderer, Mick Strider, Ernie Emerson, all of their stuff, even Greg Medford, all that stuff is kind of the same idea. They've got a workshop, they make their knives repeatedly, in smaller volumes. And then also all your knife maker branded mid-techs, like your Graham Midtech Razel here, your Brad Southern Dolk, those sorts of affairs where you've got knives that should all be the same, but they're made in smaller batches. The idea here is that you hope to have much better quality in this smaller volume sort of world than in the large volume, because you're making fewer knives. But still, so those are kind of the classically thinking production sorts of knives, and this distinction can be a little blurry. Chris Reeve is borderline large production, and, Ferrum Forge, I don't know. We'll talk about where they could fall later on. But let's go ahead. A little further down the continuum is your modifications to production knives, where you take an existing production knife and then you do something to it to make it unique. This is an example of this. This is on loan from my buddy Nico. This is a CKF muscle, but it's been pretty heavily modified. They've done an acid wash here, and they've also done a custom anodization. So this is, at its core, a production knife, a production CKF muscle, but it's unlike any other one out there in the world, so that makes it a little bit more custom. You also get people who do this at the factory. Ferrum Forge is huge on doing this. Very often they will make a bunch of knives that are fundamentally similar, but they'll give each one a slightly different pattern or anodization. You also get, your maker's choice through Ferrum Forge or elsewhere, where you'll make some hand tweaks to it to make it a little bit more exceptional. Or even hand grinds. John Graham was doing that for a little while, where he'd take a Graham Midtech and then he'd put a hand complex grind on it, which makes it a little bit more unique than a normal Midtech. That's kind of a neat little sort of affair. Moving on, you can get into another territory that's right on the edge of custom, and for a lot of people it is over the edge, but these are your one-at-a-time or customizable production knives. The reason, these are the kinds of things like the Grimsmo Norseman here, or your Gareth Bull Miura is another one, or the Smock SK23 that I reviewed previously. At a fundamental level, every Grimsmo Norseman is basically the same knife. The blade shape is going to be largely the same. All of the parts are going to be largely the same, but there are customizations that you can do to them. You can get your own anodization color, you can get your own, and for instance, they're numbered. And more importantly, though, each one of them is made by the knife maker very specifically from, according to spec. It's not just that they got a bag of parts necessarily, it's that they're making what they need to do. And so that's kind of a different level. You also get these in like Smock Knives, Curtis, Brian Nadeau, Jake Hoback. All of those things are not quite custom in that each one is going to be pretty similar to the last one. In fact, pretty much identical. But it is handmade by the maker. And so the fit and finish is higher, and if you can do so, you can very often get customizations. You can get a Miura that looks different than every other Miura, even though it is still fundamentally a Gareth Bull Miura. And so, these offer an interesting compromise in that you get the refinement of a production design and the ability to really lock in that fit and finish by doing the same thing over and over again. But you get some options. You get to customize a little bit. And you get something that is still unique, whether it's because it's numbered or custom done or because, well, it's something that you asked for specifically. Either way, this is kind of that area where production and custom starts to get a little bit blurry. Let's move on and cross that line. In my personal opinion, you cross the line into custom when you start to add in handmade elements. So these are things like your Shirogorov custom division, where they take a Shirogorov knife, but they add in some other element, some other component, maybe a custom scale or a custom blade. Or like Olemic Cutlery makes these custom knives, where fundamentally they look different. They've got file work, they've got, the handle is going to be fundamentally different than any other Olemic Wayfarer, for instance. But at the same time, it's still a Wayfarer. Todd Begg seems to do a lot of these, and even the Hinderer and Strider customs seem to be in this vein, where you'll get a handmade blade, for instance, a hand ground, and, some special hardware. Where, fundamentally, most of the knife is still production, but at the same time, there is that hand love from a maker, and there are parts of it that are completely and entirely unique. You can move further on from that into the knife makers who kind of make models of custom knife. So Peter Recenti's a great example of this. He'll make like the Recenti Nirvana. Every Recenti Nirvana is kind of similar to the next one. Fundamentally, they're all going to have the same features, the same overall shape. You might get changes according to your order or according to your desires or the maker's whims. One might be a little bit bigger, one might be a little bit smaller, but fundamentally, they're all Nirvanas, and they're all more similar to each other than they are different. Same thing with Cody Utzler regulators, same thing with Derek Monroe makes the Sigil line, where they're all unique, but they're all very similar to one another. And that can be a nice little compromise because you get a more refined model. I know how to make, Recenti that is, knows how to make a Nirvana that has no problems. And so he's not remaking the wheel every time. But you're still getting something that is substantially handmade and substantially hand-done. Then you can go even further, where you get a one-off sort of custom knife. And that's this right here is an example of that. This is a John Graham custom Razel, where the handle pattern is custom ground. It's different from any other Graham out there. The grind on the blade is entirely different as well. He may repeat some motifs over and over again, but by and large, each one of these is going to be substantially different than the rest of them. And so there may be patterns or overall ideas, but nonetheless. So this is an example of the one-off custom sort of world, and this is what people like John Graham, Martin Sleege, Brad Southern, a whole bunch of other makers do. And then finally, you can get into your wrought knives. And I don't own any of these, and I probably never will. But these are the really high-end stuff. Knives by really well-known, effectively, sculptors like Ron Best, Tim Zawada, Brian Ty, Stan Wilson, all these people who make knives that are... They've kind of really abandoned the pretense of being functional cutting tools and have moved into, I am making a beautiful sculpture that's shaped largely like a knife. They're spectacular objects, but fundamentally, they've got very little in common with this top of the line here. So this is kind of the scale that I've come up with to think about this kind of thing in my own life. And let's talk a little bit about what this means for you as a knife collector and user. I mean, fundamentally, as I kind of hinted at, you're moving from cutting tool up here at the top all the way down to art, down at the bottom. I mean, no one's really arguing that your Ontario Rat #1 here is anything but a functional cutting tool. I mean, sure, you may like elements of the design, but that's not fundamentally what it's about. Then someplace in the middle here, in the small volume of the one at a time, you can get knives that have an artistic touch to them. They've certainly got a flair, but still, at a fundamental level, they're aiming to be knives, and they're treated as carry objects and tools. But then if you go way further down into your custom world, you're looking at something that is truly artistic, and really sort of the knife making has taken a backseat to the art making, and that's a fundamentally different sort of thing, and that comes across in functionality. If you're just looking for a knife to cut things with, this is really where you belong. I mean, anywhere past the small volume production, and the curve of diminishing returns is really unforgiving, and you end up with other sorts of issues. People don't really consider how carryable a knife is as you get further down in this range. I mean, with an art knife, it doesn't even make sense, but even with some of your custom knives, you're just not thinking about that. Or you might not think about disassembly, because who's going to take apart a $3,000 art knife? That's just not a thing, and so you're not going to have hardware. You might end up with something that looks very pretty, but has non-functional hardware, something along those lines. And, you know, it's that trade-off. Up here, function is in the driver's seat, as is value and other things, and down here, fundamentally, it's all about art. In terms of fit and finish and quality, ideally, as you go down this scale, fit and finish should be going up. And, I mean, that's definitely true towards the top here. In your large volume production, if you're making 11,000 Delicas this month, well, by God, there were going to be a couple that are going to slip out that are not so great, and some companies have a lot of trouble with quality control in these large volumes. But if you go to a smaller shop, like, for instance, Chris Reeve Knives or Shirogorov, you should have less quality control issues because there are fewer people working on it. They're making fewer knives. They can afford to spend a little more time to make each one right. And in the Midtech country, that quality control needs to be right on for it to even make any sense. But the thing is, once you get down to like this area here, where each one is being handmade by a maker, even according to a pattern, at that point your quality should basically be perfect. And, you know, so past down this area, it should be absolutely great in fit and finish. But it is always useful to remember that there are definitely people who make crappy one-off knives out there in the world. There are people who have trouble on a regular basis delivering something that's, well, of any quality. And so, and you should also keep in mind that it is very often easier to make the same thing over and over again and do it right than it is to make something once and get it perfect. That's a different skill. And so production sorts of things do have an advantage in that way. Of course, this has a relationship with price. You know, up in this variety, the large volume, it's pretty much anything under like $300. In your 300 to 500 range, you're looking at small volume or modified production. In your 600 to maybe 1200 range, you should really start to be expecting one at a time sorts of prices. One at a time sorts of production. And once you break 1,000, you kind of need to be down in this area. You know, you can go anywhere from like $1,000, $2,000 for these. The one-offs get very, very up there, and the art knives can be, 10 or 15 grand if that's your speed. That's not me, but it's out there. But the thing is, I mean, price gets really high, but value is really concentrated up here because, let's face it, a small volume production knife has, 95% of the knife making, of the quality, of the fit and finish of a knife down at this level. But it's at, 10%, 20% of the price. That's kind of value. Availability is much harder as you go down the scale. You can walk into a store and walk out with a ZT, but you might have to wait 5 years and put down a deposit to get get a knife by one of these high-end folks, if you could even get on the list. And repair is a huge issue here. The large volume shops are able to support you because they have warranty and parts departments. But smaller shops can be a little bit more variable. It's pretty easy to get parts out of Chris Reeve, but Shirogorov is much more difficult. They're across the world, basically. And once you start getting into this category, getting parts can be variable. I mean, if I snap the pivot on my ZT, I can get a new one in the mail to me on Tuesday. But if I would have snapped the pivot on this Garrett Bull, I'm contacting one guy guy, Gareth Bull, and hoping that he'll be able to make me a new pivot. And that might take me months, and it would cost me money. And so that's a fundamentally different thing. If you're counting on the ability to get parts and to be able to get things repaired, you need to be sticking up in this country. There are good makers, don't get me wrong, who will help you out, but that's a lot more variable. And maybe the biggest difference in my mind is actually the risk. Because once you get up into these territories, although it starts up here as well, there is a lot more risk involved. You can buy a production knife and then return it if you don't like it, depending on the retailer. And chances are you can go to a store and handle something along these lines. That's a fundamentally nice thing, and that's a huge reduction in risk. And that's even the case sometimes for your small volume. But once you start getting into the custom country, you start dealing with custom issues, like bad makers who disappear with cash. Very often paying up front is not a very good idea. I will break that rule on occasion, but it's something to keep in mind. People do on occasion just disappear with your money. And you get makers who will just make you a very, very bad knife. That's a fundamental issue that, well, it's really ugly when it happens because very often they just don't have the skill to fix it. And that sucks deeply. And you can also have issues with you buy the knife, it's a great knife, but maybe a screw strips out. Or maybe you get a really bad scratch on the blade using it or dropping it for that matter. And suddenly all of the value is gone. If you have a Ron Best knife and you accidentally screw it up by dropping it, you may be out $3 or $4 grand like that in a second. And of course, there are huge bubbles, and buying and selling in the secondary market, that's a dangerous game. Anthony over at Everyday Commentary's been on a tear about that lately with good reason. He's got some great articles. But, even if the bubble is popped, no matter the state of the market, there are a lot of baths to be taken in this area. It could be that you are just the only person who likes that really fancy custom knife you just got. And so if you need your money out of it, you're going to lose a bunch on the sale. So, there's a lot of risk as you go further up this, and I think that's something a lot of people don't think about. Your safest bet is almost always to buy from a well-known manufacturer in one of these categories, and every time you start to go down, well, you're taking a bit of a risk on a bunch of fronts. All of this ranting leads up to kind of my central points here, which is that custom knives are a fundamentally different thing and for a different kind of collector. I mean, you're getting incredible art and you can own something that is completely unique, or at least partially unique. You're also getting the chance to support knife makers' ability to do what they love, and that's a beautiful thing as well. But in this process, you get less longevity, you get less functionality, you get less serviceability, and you get way less value. And you're in a much more volatile and risky world where it's hard to find what you're after, and when you find it, you're going to spend a lot of money. And you may not like what you're getting in return, and that's just life. This might be a little controversial, and if you disagree, let me know why in the comments, but in my opinion, there's really, even if your budget would allow you to go higher, I think you're probably going to be happiest if you stay in this region here. Because in this region, you can get really great tools that are designed to work well and look really nice, with incredible industrial designs and things like that. You can get these knives made exceptionally well by smaller shops. Particularly if you're willing to go down to like this level, you can get something that is basically perfect, and that's something to behold. You can find reviews of the knives you're after from a variety of people, rather than from just like one jackass on the YouTube. That's a beautiful thing, and you can find the knife to buy it after you see the review. That's nice too. You can also use them, you can repair them, you can replace them, you can modify them. That's a nice thing. You don't lose money every time you unscrew the pivot. And you're in the very, very best part of the curve of diminishing returns. The part after it jumps up like this, but before it flatlines. And so that's really, really nice. And most of all, if you buy it in this region, particularly up top here, you can buy a knife and then have money left over for, eating and paying rent and going on vacations and giving to charity. Those important things in the life that are slightly more important than owning nice knives. So there's nothing stopping you whatsoever from having a high-end showpiece or two. I mean, small volume can do incredible work. And then if you go to these one-at-a-time productions, you can get something truly magnificent. And heck, if there's a production maker that you really love, or just a maker you love in general, consider supporting them by buying some customized art directly from them. But there's this sense of snobbery in the knife world where people feel like they're missing out if they're not down here or even up here, where it's a fundamentally like, oh, well, you're not a real collector unless you're down here. No, that's complete BS. 100%. The custom knife world, I've come to decide, is not necessarily better or more worthy or more interesting or more excellent. You're not a nicer or a higher quality collector if you're down in this region. It's a different scene with a different market, with different goals and a different philosophy. And at least for me, I've realized that it's not an area where I want to spend my time and money. This line for me, I think, is kind of the line. I'm just not that interested. Every time I review something down here, or frankly, every time I buy something down here, it doesn't make that much sense to me. And so it's not an area where I'm going to be spending my time and money. And I'm even a little worried about this region over here. So, I'm not going to be crossing this line very much in my review. I've got a couple of things that I've already filmed that, will air and that are past this point. But as an enthusiast and as a reviewer, I'm kind of done with this region down here. Again, everybody's got different tastes, and that's a fundamentally different world. But I realize, well, it's just not the world for me. So, I hope this has been interesting. Sorry about the long rant, but mostly I hope that whatever you are collecting, that you enjoy the heck out of it, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.